In the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany began a relentless aerial campaign against Britain. Fresh from victory over France, the Luftwaffe expected a swift and decisive victory. However, what followed was a turning point in the Second World War. Against what appeared to be impossible odds, Britain held firm. So what went wrong for the Germans? To find out, we spoke to Dr. Victoria Taylor, a historian specializing in the Luftwaffe. Today, we are in the operations room at the Imperial War Museum Duxford, the nerve center of Duxford's defense during the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain is, of course, an iconic aerial campaign, but so often we focus on the Anglo-centric story. Today, we're going to look at the Battle of Britain from the German perspective. Were they quite as invincible as is often presented? By July 1940, Nazi Germany had already, the miracle of 1940, swept through much of Europe. France and the Low Countries had fallen in a matter of weeks, but Britain refused to surrender. Now Hitler planned to attack. The Luftwaffe's job was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, gain control of the skies, and pave the way for an invasion. The German Luftwaffe was riding high on a wave of success. But even though there was a sense of jubilation at the so-called wonder of 1940, the reality and the toll for the Luftwaffe's airmen was quite different. They had sustained losses along the way: 30% of their bomber force, 30% of their dive bombers, and 20% of their precious Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters by the end of the fall of France. Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, hoped that the Luftwaffe could clear the skies of Britain within a matter of weeks. But for some of the war-hardened men, the British Spitfires they had encountered over Dunkirk suggested otherwise, and they knew that now, in the Battle of Britain, those dogfights would be fiercer than ever. And it wasn't just British aircraft. Was Britain really alone? Royal Navy remained the largest in the world, capable of inflicting devastating losses on any German invasion fleet. Meanwhile, the RAF had a revolutionary air defense network known as the Dowding System. Furthermore, while Britain is often said to have fought alone, in reality, it could call on help from its empire, the United States, and from people with governments in exile. In the UK, all of this meant that defeating Britain would be very difficult. Was the Luftwaffe leadership really up for the task? Göring was a liability, a haphazard commander, leadership problems, a grandiose narcissist still trapped in the First World War. Next to Göring were Hugo Spörl and Albert Kesselring. Spörl was far more cautious and conservative, while Albert Kesselring was more reckless and impulsive. With these egos tussling, and also being eclipsed by Göring's, you can see the potential for trouble. The RAF's fighter command was spearheaded by Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, ably assisted by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of 11 Group, the group that was particularly heavily targeted during the Battle of Britain. Heading 12 Group, meanwhile, was Trafford Leigh-Mallory. The rivalries between these men are infamous. But what's important is that they pulled together when Britain needed it. They were careful to keep the right reserves and to ensure that Britain and Fighter Command continued to tick over during the Battle of Britain. The German campaign began on July 2, 1940, Kanalkampf, Channel Battle, when they started attacking shipping in the English Channel. This Kanalkampf or Channel Battle was the first phase of the Battle of Britain. The Channel Battle is often skipped over by historians and observers, but actually it's a really important phase. The Luftwaffe launched around 1,300 sorties, sank a lot of shipping, and worried the British enough that sometimes they had to halt shipping through the Strait of Dover in daylight hours. The Channel Battle was trying to put political as well as military pressure on Britain, but it was also trying to gauge what was happening in this strange watery no-man's land. After 5 weeks of fighting with heavy losses, Adlerangriff, Eagle attack. On both sides, the Germans were ready to step up their attacks. They launched the next phase of the battle, the Adlerangriff or Eagle attack, on August 13, 1940, known as Eagle Day. The aim was to destroy vital British infrastructure like airfields, radar installations, and aircraft factories. But it did not get off to an auspicious start. In the morning, there was a miscommunication between German bombers and the crystals in there. Radios had not been upgraded to be compatible with those of the fighter aircraft. As a result, they headed into the lion's den without their fighter escorts, and the massacre was painful. The Germans did pick up a bit more momentum in the afternoon of Eagle Day. They hit some radar stations and some aircraft on the ground, but it was not the monumental day they had hoped. For just 2 days later, the Germans suffered what is known as Schwarzer Donnerstag or Black Thursday. Rather than setting its talons into Britain, its wings were being clipped. The intensity of the fighting continued to grow, with combined losses peaking. On August 18th, known as the Hardest Day, southern England was now a battlefield, with hundreds of aircraft forming mass melees in the sky. The costs were high, but the Germans felt they were pushing the British to the brink of defeat. The problem was they were wrong. Intelligence failures. Both sides were plagued by intelligence failures during the Battle of Britain. Joseph Beppo Schmid, for instance, was Göring's yes-man, often distorting numbers and telling Göring what he wanted to hear, underestimating British numbers. Kesselring was convinced by early September 1940 that the RAF's fighter command was pretty much wiped out. On the other hand, estimates suggested it was closer to 1,000 aircraft, which was more accurate. The British had around 600 to 700 fighters left. This hugely changed the dynamics of the Battle of Britain for the Luftwaffe. The problems didn't end there. German airfields in occupied territory were only half built and in need of repair. German aircraft, which had proved useful in previous campaigns like the Bf-110 and Ju-87 Stuka, were having their flaws exposed. And when British aircraft were shot down, the pilots could bail out over friendly territory and return to the fight within hours, while German pilots shot down in battle were lost for good. However, the biggest problem for the Luftwaffe was the English Channel itself. The famous Bf-109 fighter pilot Ulrich. Kanalkrankheit, channel sickness. Steinhilper, for instance, described the phenomenon of Kanalkrankheit or channel sickness. This was an unusual case of increased consumption of alcohol and cigarettes, weight loss, diarrhea, depression, all directly linked to the strain of flying over the English Channel. Fear of a watery death, whether through hypothermia or drowning, was so pronounced in the Luftwaffe that sometimes airmen took pistols into the air in case they needed to end it all. Even by Eagle Day itself, there's a fascinating letter from a junior doctor in a Luftwaffe bomber wing saying, "We need to be relieved by the autumn of 1940 or our nerves will be shot." As August continued, the Luftwaffe did start to get their act together, and towards the end of the month, the loss ratio began to equalize between the two sides. But the battle was about to take yet another twist. On the 24th of August, German aircraft, switching targets, accidentally dropped stray bombs on London. This prompted Winston Churchill to launch a retaliatory raid on Berlin on the 25th of August. Enraged, Göring began a reprisal of his own and shifted German attacks away from airfields towards London. He hoped to destroy British morale and draw the RAF into a decisive air battle, but the decision was a disaster. Göring has jumped the gun. The Luftwaffe was not ready for that kind of protracted aerial campaign. Not only were they letting the RAF airfields breathe and recuperate, but they were also having to stretch themselves to the very limits. The Bf-109s had already been using up 2/3 of their fuel capacity just getting to Britain and back to occupied Europe. Now, it's been constrained even more. It was 20 to 30 minutes in the active combat zone. Over London, it's just 10 minutes. Moreover, they have the complexity of the fact that not only are they escorting the German bombers, but also Göring is somehow expecting the fighter pilots to draw up the last reserves of the RAF at the same time. So, who can actually carry out this impossible task? The Blitz. This new aerial offensive against British cities became known as the Blitz. For the first time, British civilians were on the front lines of the Second World War. But, far from breaking their morale, the British public maintained their resolve. Instead, after months of fighting without rest, it was the Luftwaffe that was pushed to breaking point. It's important to bear in mind that the Luftwaffe were feeling the strain too. British aircraft production had pulled ahead during 1940, managing to produce over 1,000 more fighters than the Germans. The British also had meaningful reserves, which the Germans did not. Even though Britain did struggle with a chronic lack of pilots during the Battle of Britain, its shortfall was normally about 10%. For the Germans, it was a third, and they ultimately continued to struggle to not only replace their pilots but also to replace all of their aircraft, including the bombers, that took so many more man-hour to produce. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe launched their Battle of Britain Day, largest attack yet on London. They hoped this would finally shatter the RAF and pave the way for an invasion. Instead, the British deployed their full force and repelled the assault. The aerial insurrection that comes here, the fact that the British throw up so many more fighters than the Germans realized still existed, was a huge blow to the Luftwaffe's morale. As Otto Besseler, who was a Luftwaffe bomber pilot, says, they actually come home from the 15th of September, 1940, and he says there's drunken parties, they're weeping for comrades. And actually it's so bad for them that there is a huge rocketing in its suicide rates. The Germans actually see nearly 80 suicide attempts or suicides between the middle of September 1940 into October 1940. The Germans have felt such exhaustion about this campaign. They cannot sustain it much longer. And as we get towards the end of October 1940, the daylight portion of the raids starts to peter out and make way for the nighttime offensive. Realizing the battle was lost, Hitler postponed his invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe continued the nighttime bombing of British cities until 1941, when their focus switched to supporting the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So why did the Luftwaffe fail to win the Battle of Britain? Well, ultimately it was a mixture. Why did Germany lose the Battle of Britain? Of issues. From the beginning, its vision was completely splintered. This is what caused all of this up and down and around over its choices as to what to target. It also suffered from a number of intelligence failures, but ultimately it was simply just too much of a stretch. They were having to contend with flying over the channel there and back, day after day, month after month, until its airmen broke down. The Luftwaffe wore itself into the ground during the Battle of Britain. It tried to do too much and ultimately it achieved too little.